she didn't think I had them. And I look at it like almost every morning before I go to school. And you're in it.
I remember seeing pictures that it was like warm.
Oh, brother. Yes, she was. There was a time, I wasn't amazed. There was a time when Micah was and Micah's, yeah. It's a great picture. So anyway, I love looking at it.
Look at me, look at the cat. We have such fond memories of that, and every time this
Yes.
but I remember that first.
So anyway,
That's so
you are joining me about almost every morning. I take a look.
special. I'm really about
Oh, fun. Oh, yes.
Good evening. We are already watching the clock because we want to pack as much in tonight as possible. So we are going to start promptly. Welcome. We're glad you came. Welcome to those watching us on live stream. You can sit wherever you want. Yeah. For those of you who may not know us, I am Lori Judson. I am a preschool speech-language pathologist in Goshen Schools, and this is Deanna Beth Chupp. She is a private music teacher and does a lot more. I'll let her tell you about that. This is the third time we've taught this class, and so we feel like maybe we're getting better each time. So we want to start by talking about our own experiences with the Enneagram and how we came to the Enneagram. My introduction to the Enneagram was not earth-shattering. It began quietly, kind of like a whisper. My sister-in-law and brother visited us one weekend a couple falls ago, and my sister-in-law started talking about the Enneagram and what it had meant in her life. And I'm sure I had heard the word before, but I really didn't have any feeling one way or the other about it. I think I just thought of it as a personality tool, and that's all I knew. So she told me a test to take, and I took it, and came out as either a 3 or a 1. Didn't really know much more than that, except I knew I wanted to do things right and look good. So the next step was our family usually has a book discussion over Christmas because we're cool like that. And she suggested that we read the book that we are studying for the next 13 weeks, 11 weeks. And so we read it. I read it in the car on the way to South Carolina and quickly ruled out many of the numbers around the circle. I wasn't an 8, I wasn't a 9, I wasn't a 7, 5, 4. Pretty much came back to 3 or 1. And I think the thing that stood out to me most about the 1 at that time was the teaching on the inner critic. And I really resonated with that idea of a voice in your head telling you that you could do better. You could always improve yourself, your body, your mind, your family. You could always do something better. I really resonated with that, and in fact, was completely shocked when I found out that other numbers do not have that voice in their head. I asked Chris what his inner voice was telling him, and he said, I don't have that in my head. So that part was really surprising to me. The thing that I did not resonate with immediately was the idea of anger, that the 1's passion or deadly sin was anger. And I remember processing that with a friend, Deanna Beth, and saying, I just don't think I'm an angry person. And she kind of smirked at me, but kindly went on, and then in the process of our conversation, I must have used a word like irritated or upset, and she said, I wonder if those aren't just cute words for anger. And so I was kind of irritated with her, but I processed that, and as I processed that, I realized that yes, all those words that I use, frustration, irritation, upset, are all words for anger. And that was often my first response to a situation or the underlying feeling that came forth first. And so those two things, that inner critic and that anger response, really led me down my path of studying the one. And even though when I came to the Enneagram, it was quietly and not with a bang, it has been life-changing. It has taught me not only about myself, but how I interact with those around me. And I'll be honest, we're going to talk tonight about how some of this is not fun, that this work is not always super fun to go through. I did not like myself. I didn't want to be a one. The one's not fun. The one's angry. The one's critical. The one always has to be perfect or have other people be perfect. And I didn't want to be that one. I wanted to be the fun one. But I feel like the Enneagram has given me ways to understand that it's okay to be who I am, that my particular skill set, what I bring when I come into a group is important, that this is the way I was made, and I can seek to be the healthiest version of myself, but it's okay to be who I am. And that's what we hope for you as you seek to learn your numbers as well.
I am Deanna Beth Chubb, and I teach private piano lessons and volunteer here and there. In this season, though, I'm pretty much doing as little as possible because I'm also in cancer treatment, and it's going fine. 2 more weeks of chemo. All right, my testimony about the Enneagram is quite personal. About 10 years ago, I started working in a group in a work service kind of thing. I was actually in charge of this group. And there were 1 or 2 strained relationships in it, which contributed to a pretty tense work situation, work volunteer, really. And consequently, a pretty tense life for me. It really impacted my inner world, like Monday through Sunday, really. In the spring of 2017, it finally came to an end, but it did so with heartbreak and religious trauma, broken trust, broken relationships, and the loss of community. And even though that was a time that I felt really alone, I had a couple of friends who listened compassionately and loyally to me. And better yet was that one of them suggested that this season of self-reflection could be a good time to look into the Enneagram. And better still is that I did. And it really is, without a doubt, the most healing thing I've experienced in adulthood. Learning the Enneagram was healing in a way that other personality theories haven't been necessarily. I think that theories like Enneagram, Myers-Briggs, DISC assessment, and temperament continue to be developed and studied because we're all looking for ways to do better and feel better and think better, both within ourselves and in our relationships with others. And this can apply in daily ways. Lori didn't touch on how it's turned into like family language, really. The boys are aware of their types, and it's part of the way they discuss family practices and relationships. But it can also play a role in crises and traumas, as I experienced. And if you're caught up on your reading, no shame if you did, but Ian Cron, one of the authors of the book, had a crisis too that also led him to his introduction to the Enneagram. The Enneagram is just one tool to do better, to increase your maturity, your personal and spiritual life. It's one tool to do that, but it's a good one. So we're delighted to introduce it to you or deepen your existing knowledge this winter, whether you're starting from scratch or you're building on a firm foundation already. Lori will have a video for us shortly, but we think probably everyone who's going to attend in person is here already, and those who are live streaming are tuned in. And Cindy's just asked us to remind you that if you haven't paid your $10 toward the book, that you can do that in a basket at the back of the sanctuary. If you write a check, just put Enneagram in the memo.
So I'm going to just show you a little video that might help you relate to some of these different numbers. Okay, so I feel like I should say as a 1, it's very important for me to do the media part right, so be patient with me. Let's try this again. I'm not sure why it's not working. It's not a disaster if it doesn't, but it did every other time.
Let's do this for now. Maybe.
It's okay if it does.
Huh, that is so weird. Huh.
I might be able to move on. Thanks. Okay. Thank you, Colin. Well, I'm not even going to obsess about that. It's okay.
We'll just move on.
We'll just move on.
All right. So, what is the purpose of the Enneagram? Some people describe it as fascinating, and it is. I want to tell you that simply knowing your type and a few things about it is good for little else than making interesting dinner party conversation, and that's okay. If we're at a dinner party together, I'm going to want you to be interesting. But the Enneagram is best used as a tool for personal and spiritual development. On a personal level, we may find that without self-awareness, we seem to have patterns of behavior that are sometimes unhelpful in our relationships with others, or simply in being the kind of person that we wish to be. I could bring up the Roman scripture, what I wish to do, I do not do, what I hate, I do. With ever-deepening knowledge of ourselves, maybe through the Enneagram, we get to be more in charge of choosing a response. So, without any kind of inner work, we're relying solely on the stress of our personality, the type of our personality. With a little bit of work, we get to the point of self-knowledge. We know ourselves and to some extent why we're wired the way we are. But we want to get beyond that to self-awareness. When we're aware, we catch ourselves in the moment, acting in the stress of our type. And being aware, we are not as likely to be carried away by impulse. We're more able to choose different responses, ones that better represent the person we wish to be. And we can learn to disengage with the parts of our personalities that limit us. On a spiritual level, Ian Cron seems to have a lot to say about how this tool for self-awareness puts a person more ready to be who our Creator intended us to be, fully embracing the strengths and traits that God put into us. And there's a quote in our book from John Calvin, "Without knowledge of self, there is no knowledge of God." Once we learn it, it's very likely that we'll be more understanding and compassionate towards others and to ourselves. And that leads to a world that is kinder and more compassionate. And that's the work of people of faith, I think, which is why I think the Enneagram belongs in church. We're so glad you joined us for this investigation into the Enneagram. It has been life-changing for Lori and for myself, and we want everyone to know about it. So let me tell you about the format that can be expected each week. This first week, we'll introduce the Enneagram, and then we'll just briefly introduce you to each of the 9 types that the Enneagram recognizes. This week is going to be very lecture-heavy. Don't let it chase you away. I'll typically go over the content from the chapter of the book, sometimes supplemented by other sources. And then on the type-specific weeks, so for the following 9 weeks, we'll spend a large part of the evening processing through an interview with a type-specific guest. I find that we learn better hearing straight from the people who have done their work and know themselves well than from theoretical discussion. And Lori will finish the teaching content by presenting useful spiritual disciplines for each individual type to promote inner peace and growth. And we're hoping that sometimes we will have time at the end of class to process questions that you might have. And we decided, since this is both being offered in person and remotely, that you all could submit your questions to both of our email addresses, which are on the screen right now. You can submit those to us. We'll have time to choose them and process, some helpful content that we can direct you toward. And from time to time, we'll have weeks where we can do that together. And we're theorizing about a final wrap-up week to process together corporately and maybe in small groups. There may be times when it would be helpful for you to have your books with you. And if I were involved in this study in the role that you're playing, I would want to have pen and paper there, because there will be things that strike me that I'll want to think about further later on, and I would want to jot them down. But rest assured, nobody's going to quiz you over the reading or DocuPoints if you come without supplies. Your knowledge and your compassion and grace for one another will increase if all you do is attend regularly, empty-handed, observe and listen. The first chapter of the book, there are 2 actual intro chapters in the book before they get to the type-specific stuff. And the first chapter explains the history of the Enneagram. They trace the roots of the ancient Enneagram all the way back to the 4th century, with the modern Enneagram getting traction in the United States in the last 50 or 60 years. It's an ancient theory of understanding and explaining human behavior. Our personality comes into play as individuals, like internally, the way we feel about ourselves and the world, and through our relationships with others. Our personality type is determined through identifying the motivation for our choices and behaviors. That's from the EnneagramJourney.org. And we'll clarify our understanding of personality now. So years ago, I did a study in church about temperament. And everyone agrees that temperament is what you're born with. You arrive on earth with certain qualities ready to develop. But personality develops over time based on not just your temperament, but also experiences that you have early in childhood. And it took me a while to embrace the definition of personality that the book gives. On page 22, it describes personality as a mask, and what is a mask? Something false. A mask over our authentic selves to protect us from harm and to help us make our way. And I thought for a really long time, gosh, that sounds negative. I guess I didn't see why a person's personality couldn't be her authentic self, or why a person can't naturally and innocently strive for certain things in life without a dark underbelly. But I have come to understand for myself that many things that I long for and strive for do have their roots in a lack or a heartache from long ago. So if you're doing a book study on the Enneagram, you're probably well aware that the debate has raged for years about whether our personalities and character mostly develop due to nature or nurture. Enneagram describes personality as made up of innate qualities, so that's the nature part. That's how we arrive on earth, with our innate qualities. But it's also combined with coping strategies, conditioned reflexes, and defense mechanisms. So the implication is that it's a combination of both nature and nurture. And you might ask, well, coping from what? Well, that depends from person to person who's having their own individual experiences. And defense mechanisms, defense against what? That depends on the childhood you were having. Now, because it's an ancient theory, it was taught orally from teacher to student in those early days. And each teacher sort of had their own language to describe it. The kernel of it remains true, but you do see and hear differences from time to time. I have talked to other local Enneagram users who say, I heard different ages than the ones I'm about to give you. But our teachers, Ian Cron and Suzanne Stabile, say that your type is determined by the time you're 6 or 7 years old, and you're fully acting on your developed personality by the age of 18. So when we talk about those coping strategies and learned responses from early childhood, we are talking about early childhood if it's in place by the time you're 6 or 7. Now, hopefully you all received many positive messages in your childhood in combination with the less helpful messages that we all get. But we don't have to heal from the positive messages. We just have to reframe and heal from the less helpful ones. Lori has a really helpful, beautiful way of explaining how the childhood experience can be viewed.
So there's 3 different ways of looking at the messages of the childhood experience. We often hear it called the childhood wound. We'd like to offer that there are some other ways to describe that, the childhood lie or the confirmed belief. So it may really be a wound. We have to honor the fact that some children live through trauma and that some parents intentionally say things to their children that are hurtful. So some children may receive intentional wounding messages in their childhood. You may have received that. It may also be a lie. So it's something that, as opposed to a wound, which implies harm done to us, a lie refers to something that we come to believe falsely. So it may not have been said implicitly that we always have to be good, or that we can't rely on other people, or that we can't trust anyone. But we came to believe that through experiences in our childhood. The third way that we could look at it leans more heavily on the nature end of the Enneagram, that we are born a certain way, and this is the confirmed belief. So it talks about being raised by parents who had the best of intentions, or being parents ourselves who hopefully said mostly positive things to our children, but we look and learn through a certain lens. And because we have that lens, we heard messages that maybe weren't said to us. So even if it was not my parents' intent to let me know that I had to be good all the time, or that it was not okay to make mistakes, because I'm a 1, that's the lens I was looking through, and that's what I came to believe. It allows me to be gracious with my parents, have a good relationship with my parents, because I know that they did not intend to wound me, they did not intend to give me false messages. It also gives me grace as a parent, because I've tried very hard to give my children positive messages, and my younger son will still say to me, well, I feel like I'm not enough. And so I have to give myself grace that that was the lens he was looking through. And even though I may have done things wrong, he still was looking through a lens where he came to believe that.
As children, we're looking for ways to do what we sense is required to please our parents, to fit in with our peers, to get our basic needs met, and to satisfy the expectations of the culture. I want to mention here that J.E. Mize taught an introduction to the Enneagram to his Nurture Hour group several years ago, and he said that the vast majority of that group identified as 1s or 9s. Now, you don't necessarily, if you're a beginner, know what a 1 or a 9 is. The 1 is the perfectionist. That's our friend Lori here. They're called the perfectionist or the reformer, and the 9 is called the peacemaker. So I want to just introduce the topic that in the Mennonite community, these are deeply held values, to be perfect and to be meek. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but I thought it was worth mentioning here when we're saying that satisfying the expectations of the culture is part of what helps us to develop, or causes us to develop. They would say developing a personality is not the helpful thing, it's a mask, right? Remembering that personality is a mask or a false front, we no longer need it once the threats of childhood have passed. Kind of an interesting way to think of it if you had a relatively happy childhood. But once we have our own agency, these personalities no longer help us, they hinder us, they hold us back. But we become so ingrained, these strategies become so ingrained in us and so automatically triggered by outside stimuli that we seem to have less and less awareness of, and therefore less control over it. And at this point, as I said, instead of protecting us, it limits us. So think of the healthiest, most integrated version of ourselves, one that's not relying on a personality, but one that uses the whole spectrum of the Enneagram as a house with 9 beautiful rooms, each room fully functional for the job that you were supposed to do in it and perfectly appointed for it. We've got a kitchen for preparing food, a dining room for eating it, a parlor for entertaining people, an office for doing your work, media room for screen time, and so on. But in our own brick and mortar houses, don't we have places that we gravitate toward? I know that when all 5 of our family are home and somebody wants something special to drink with dinner, if whoever's setting the table and placing the drinks knows where to put my coffee or Mike's orange juice or something like that, and they don't have to ask where's anybody sitting, they just know where we sit. If all 5 of us are sitting and watching a movie, I can tell you exactly where everybody's sitting. Not because it's assigned seats, not because we're even thinking about it. It's automatic. It's automatic and instinctual. So what if we tried to operate our personalities and operate our life from that just one spot of our personality and conduct all our business from our side of the bed? We're preparing our food, we're eating it. We're entertaining guests, we're doing our business, we're having our screen time. We could probably muddle through, but it would be more efficient and more appropriate if we used the full spectrum of the house. The same is true for the full spectrum of the Enneagram and incorporating all the characteristics that our Creator provided to humankind. An Enneagram-informed friend heard that this study was taking place, and she said, "Oh, it would be so fun to study the Enneagram in church." And I thought, fun? Like, I'm not sure I find it fun to come face to face with my failings and flaws, but new understanding is certainly energizing to me because it leads to growth. Other personality typing systems like Myers-Briggs or DISC seem to talk more generally about personality characteristics and might focus more on the positive qualities than the negative ones. Enneagram tends to focus pretty honestly about the negative qualities of each number. And this is because people identify more readily with a number when things are going wrong. If we make a plan and it's executed perfectly, we just think that's how it should be. We don't tend to congratulate ourselves too much on our perfect execution of it. It was just the plan and it went forth. But when we find that there are patterns of things not going wrong, we're like, oh, there's people out there that don't know how to prioritize what to do first. Oh, there's people out there that postpone and delay. What's the word I'm looking for? Why can't I find that word? Procrastinate, yeah. Chemo brain fog is real. Okay, so they procrastinate because it's not fun, they want to run away from the stuff, or there's people who tend to steamroll when a job is to be done. They'll say, wait a second, that might be a pattern for me. They're recognizing themselves when things are going wrong. So, a quote in our reading is that no one should work with the Enneagram if what they seek is flattery, but no one should fail to do so if what they seek is a deep knowing of self. That's been true for me. Finding your type. No type is better or worse than another. Each has its own strengths and weaknesses, and none is gender biased. That's the first thing you need to know. It's safe to be any of these numbers. The next thing I want you to know is that an Enneagram type doesn't pigeonhole you into one type of behavior. It doesn't pigeonhole you out of individuality. No two 4s or 1s are identical or interchangeable. Ian Cron likes it to a color. You're blue, and you're the only blue in the world just like you, but you're still blue. There are factors that give each type unique flavor, but you only have one type. And though we hope it gets richer and more healthy as you age, it doesn't change to a new number as you age, or after a trauma, or in addiction or recovery. You're just, any time in life, closer to or further away from good health. Suzanne Stabile teaches that the spectrum of health in Enneagram is healthy up at the tippy top, and then average, and then unhealthy, and then a term called in excess, and down at the bottom is pathological. That's the least healthy. We're going to teach primarily to average space because that's where most of us spend most of our time. And we'll never address the pathological because Lori and I aren't mental health professionals. We're Enneagram users, not experts. Now, if you feel pretty confident that you're generally in healthy space, you're probably wrong. The high side of average is a good goal for most of us. And Suzanne Stabile also teaches that we can make healthy and unhealthy choices in the span of an hour. So you should not congratulate yourself that feeling healthy in a moment sets you sitting pretty for a season, because you might make a different choice in 20 minutes. The road back to you is a primer. It's just an introduction, and the Enneagram is rich and complex. You'll get introduced to a taste of some factors that will color your number in one direction or another, but try not to get bogged down or overwhelmed. Just keep reading and learning and coming back each week. The next bit of advice, I want to say rule, is don't type your family members or friends or others. You're probably going to. You're probably writing their names in the margins. But don't. But when you do, I need you to know that the Enneagram is very honest about flaws and failings. So if a person hears that you've typed them as something with just a little bit of digging, they are unlikely to be flattered. Suzanne Stabile also names her teaching the Enneagram journey, because the process is always evolving and growing for each individual. Trying to teleport someone to the destination of your choice is robbing them from the journey of self-discovery. The other thing I want to tell you is that you're really not qualified to know the Enneagram type of anyone else, because remember, what determines a person's Enneagram type is their motivation for their behavior. And all you can reflect back is their behavior. You don't know the motivation for it. They're the only ones qualified to determine that. Now, determining your type. How many of you came tonight with a pretty good idea of your type already? Okay. And some of you might have a clear understanding and have years of study under your belt. Some might have narrowed it down to one or two. You're just starting your journey, and some are completely starting from scratch. With just a little bit of digging online, you'll see that there are free online tests available. I wouldn't discourage the use of them, but hold those results really lightly in an open hand, because they are wrong 60% of the time. In order to get an authentic result, you have to be really giving authentic, self-aware answers. And until you're in the practice of authentic self-observation and all this navel-gazing that the Enneagram will encourage, you're probably not giving the most authentic, self-aware answers. Too many questions, anyway. But the tests can be useful for giving you a place to start reading. Some of the tests will give you a result of just one, like they'll say, oh, you're a 4. I like the ones that at least say you score high in these 3, because then it's not being so definite, it's giving you a good place to start reading and learning. Some examples of some mistypings are, it said that church-going women are often mistyped as 2s. 2s are called the helpers. They're very warm, very personal, very nurturing. They serve others and put their needs last. And that's because church-going women are doubly conditioned to do just that. It's a Christian value to have a servant's heart. It's a good value. And then women are also told by a fairly misogynistic culture that that's what an ideal woman looks like and behaves like as well. So sometimes, again, the expectations of the culture sort of muddy the water. And because we're talking about the expectations of the culture here, I'm going to come back to J.E.'s class again, most of whom thought they were all 1s or 9s. If you're using the Enneagram for personal and spiritual development, it's kind of important that you're working on the right issues. So I just want you to be open when you feel the pull, as good and proper Mennonites, that you must be a 1 or a 9. I want you to just leave a little space for maybe that's the expectations of the culture muddying the waters. Maybe it's just your values, but not your true core motivations. Leave space for that. Suzanne Stabile suggests that the best way to determine your type is to absorb a brief description of each one and cross out any that are clearly not you. And hopefully, you'll be able to eliminate at least half of them. And that'll narrow your search. From there, you can continue to narrow down based on other information that you'll learn about soon. This will not be done in 1 week. Now, I will give you a brief, painfully brief description of each of the 9 types now. They're going to be pretty general and mostly focus on the positive. We'll start with 1. And if you have pen and paper, you might just write down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And when you hear one that you know for sure isn't you, you're just going to cross that number out. Type 1 is sometimes called the perfectionist, sometimes the reformer. They are highly ethical, dedicated, reliable. They're rational and idealistic, very principled and purposeful, self-controlled, perfectionistic. They are motivated by a desire to live in the right way and improve the world, and it's important to them to avoid fault and blame. Criticism is hard for them. None of us love it, but it's especially hard for the 1. And a unique characteristic of the 1 is that presence of an inner critic that's always telling them to do and be better. And I could tell right away that I'm not a 1. Type 2, this is the type that church-going women are often mistyped as. They're called the helper. They're warm, caring, giving, interpersonal, very relational people. They're emotionally demonstrative, generous, people-pleasing. They can be possessive, and they're motivated by a need to be loved and needed, and to avoid acknowledging their own needs. Type 3, sometimes called the performer, sometimes called the achiever. They're very success-oriented, and they're pretty image-conscious. They're productive and pragmatic, adaptable, excelling. They excel in life because they're driven, and they're motivated by a need to be, or at least appear to be, successful and to avoid failure. Type 4, sometimes called the romantic, sometimes called the individualist. These folks are creative, sensitive, expressive, and dramatic. You see a lot of artists, musicians, poets in this category. They can be self-absorbed and temperamental, and they're motivated by a need to be understood, experience their big feelings, and avoid being ordinary. Type 5. We call these folks the investigator. They're analytical, they're intense in their interests. They have 12 tabs open on their computer all the time. They're private and perceptive and innovative. They can be secretive and attached. They're isolated, and they're motivated by a need to gain knowledge, conserve energy, I think that's important, and to be independent. So the 5s wake up in the morning with their fuel tank full, and every interaction they have throughout the day empties it a little bit, and they've always got one eye on it. And if they've had a rough day and they get home, you cannot make them have energy for anything at home. That energy conservation is big. Type 6. These are sometimes called the loyalist, sometimes called the devil's advocate, because they are often asking why. They're committed people, practical and security-oriented. They're very responsible, and they're committed to the group. They want what's best for the group more than they want what's best for themselves. So they can be suspicious of new ideas or opportunities. They're a little anxious, and they plan for worst-case scenarios. They're motivated by fear and the need for security. Type 7. They're called the enthusiast. They're fun, spontaneous, adventurous, and busy. They're very versatile. They're easily distractible and scattered. They're motivated by a need to be happy, have stimulating experiences, and to avoid pain. None of us like pain. 7s really don't think they have what it takes to handle it. Type 8. They're called the challenger or the defender. They're commanding and intense. They don't mind confrontations at all. They have a powerful and dominating personality, very confident and decisive, willful. They're motivated by a need to be strong and avoid feeling weak or vulnerable. If they're men, we call them strong leaders. If they're women, they usually hear a different name. Type 9, these are the peacemakers. They're pleasant and laid back, accommodating, easygoing, self-effacing, receptive. They reassure those around them and are agreeable and complacent. They tend not to see themselves as very important, and they're motivated by a desire to remain unaffected by the problems around them. You're probably able to eliminate a few types just based on these descriptions. At the beginning, so we've done our 2 introduction chapters, and then the next readings, the next 9 chapters are about each individual type. And every one of those chapters, the first page has 20 questions, yes or no. And make sure you spend time with those questions. I'd say if you have more than half yeses, or maybe more than 10, 12, or 15, based on how readily you give those yeses out, you should probably read those chapters quite carefully. Some people say that there might be 1 or 2 questions that they have problems with. They'll say, I can see myself responding as a yes or a no. Am I at work? Am I at home? Am I on vacation? On the golf course? I would respond differently. So our teachers, the authors, tell us that if you find yourself in that situation, you should think of how you are at home, and you should think of how you were at 20, if you're older than 20. And the reason for that is that we're most ourselves at home, and at 20, we really are acting fully on our personalities. When I think of myself at 20, if I was in my teens and the problems that I had were mostly squabbles with my mom, I could say, that's my mom. That's her problem. I just have a problem with her. But as you go through young adulthood and you have romantic partners or roommates that you have more intimate relationships with, and those patterns are still a factor, then you start to become aware of it. But it's also at that point, through your 20s, that you start making accommodations for those things. We don't want to have those problems, right? So we learn to soften, or we learn to avoid, and we're probably at our ages doing a little bit of that. So think about how you were when you were 20. If you start to feel uncomfortable during a reading of a chapter, that just may be your number. That's true for 8 of the 9 types. There's 1 type that's really happy to learn its number. So we're going to introduce you to some vocabulary. You probably got a bookmark. This was suggested by a couple of people at the church that we last taught at last year. You're going to hear some vocabulary throughout the study, and you might waste some time thinking, wait a minute, what's a wing? What's a stance or a triad? And so the bookmark has many of those terms alphabetized that you could just refer to quickly. We're going to introduce you to those and others. They're not alphabetized as we're giving them to you tonight. They're just about related content.
Okay, again, this is just an overview, just to introduce some of these vocabulary terms. We will talk about them in relation to each number as we move through the chapters. But some things that can either help to clarify your number or confuse you further are these wings and the stress and security. So The thing about the Enneagram, it recognizes that no particular number looks the same in every person. And that's because each number has contact with 4 other numbers on the Enneagram. So if you look at this chart, you can see, like if I look at my 4, it has contact with the 5 and the 3 on either side of it. Those are called wings. So the 4 may pick up traits from those wings on either side of it. They may pick up some of the traits of the 3, or they may pick up some of the traits of the 5. So that's why you'll hear people say, oh, I'm a 4-wing 3. You can only have wings that are on either side of you. You cannot be a 4-wing 7. It can only be the 2 on either side of you. Some authors believe, and Suzanne is one of them, that you may show traits from one wing in the first half of your life and from the other wing in the second half of your life. It's also true that some people do not pick up very many traits from either wing. But just know that that is a potential to make your number look a little different from somebody who may have a similar, the same number. The other 2 numbers that you have access to are your numbers that you access in stress and security. So we might also hear that called health and unhealth. We're going to refer to them as stress and security in this study. So the stress number is found, so if let's say we're at the 7, the stress number is the arrow that is moving away from the 7. So the 7 goes to the 1 in stress. So if a 7 is feeling stressed, they may pick up some of the characteristics or traits of a 1. They may become more rigid, more perfectionistic. Suzanne believes and has taught that those characteristics, those traits are necessary for that number to help them handle stress. We want to learn to pick up positive traits of the number that we go to in stress to help us handle the stress in a positive way. And then the other number that we have access to is the one we go to in security. So if you look at the 1, the number that they move to in security is the 7. So on vacation, when I am happy and there's not a lot of stress, I pick up those traits of the 7, so I can be more fun and spontaneous. I may look more like the 7 at that point. So hopefully, as we become healthy, we can access the positive traits of both the stress and the security number. Then each number has what we will refer to as either a passion or the deadly sin. So some teachers prefer the word passion because sin may have been misused in relationship to church, weaponized against a person. So we will probably use both these words, but we want to be careful when we discuss this passion or deadly sin that we're not using it in a way that weaponizes it against the person, against that number. The intent is to help us identify ourselves within a type and caution us against the unhelpful impulses that we might face as that type. So if my deadly sin or passion is gluttony, I can identify that and work against excess. To leave it unchallenged, unrecognized, is to remain in bondage to it. And then, again, we also want to look at the childhood experience, about what message we may have received either intentionally or unintentionally as a child. If one of those hits you right in the heart, that may be pushing you closer to what your particular number is. We get positive and negative messages in our childhood years, but we don't necessarily need to recover from those positive messages. So we focus here on recovering from the less helpful messages. And learning a healing message is an antidote to help our recovering from the wounding messages that we received in childhood. It helps us find our authentic selves.
The aspects of Enneagram that I'll focus on now have to do with something that's really inspired me in the last year or so of my Enneagram work, has to do with centers of intelligence. Enneagram wisdom says, it teaches that we all have 3 ways of interacting with the world, and that is through thinking, feeling, and doing. Enneagram theory further theorizes that we're all dominant in one, we get by on 2 of the 3, and we repress the 3rd. So what it's meaning that we're dominant in one is that all of us are going to tend to respond to experiences with one impulse, and that's either going to be, what do I think about that? Some of us will respond by processing, how do I feel about that? And the 3rd group will think, what am I going to do about that? Now, I don't love that question that I just put it in. I did it to complete the series. What do I think? How do I feel? What am I going to do? But saying, what am I going to do, implies that we're thinking about it first. And many of our doers are going to act without the thinking in advance. Their impulse is to do in response. And that doesn't mean that they're doing without thinking is going to lead to bad action. Sometimes it might. All of us, whether we're thinking first, have probably had that experience. Should have thought about that a little bit more. But there are people who respond from the gut. So, triads. There are a couple of different ways of grouping Enneagram types into what I would call family groups. And the first that I'll introduce you to are the triads. Triads are grouped according to what center of intelligence is dominant and how you take in or process information. So sometimes they're called gut, head, and heart, and it's easy to figure out which one is which. The gut are the doers, the head are the thinkers, the heart are the feelers. We're dominant in those things. And I'm sorry to tell you that sometimes they are also called the fear, anger, and shame triads, because those triads have a problem with that particular emotion, I guess. There are 3 types in each of the 3 categories. The anger or gut triad are your 8, 9s, and 1s. They're driven by anger. 8s tend to focus it outwardly. 8s are angry and everybody knows it. 1s focus it inwardly, and 9s, the phrase I keep hearing over and over again, 9s are asleep to their anger. Remember, 9s are the peacemaker. It's a little counterintuitive to think of them as in the anger triad. And every time that we interview a 9, I'm always interested in hearing more about what that means to be asleep to your anger. They tend to respond to life instinctually at the gut level, and they tend to be direct and honest. The shame triad, those are your 2s, 3s, and 4s. I never said what my number is. I'm a 4. So this is my triad. This is the water I swim in. We're driven by our feelings. Outwardly, they're on the feelings of others. They say that 3s have a hard time distinguishing other people's feelings for their own, because they want to please you, they want to impress you, so they sort of take the temperature of your feelings, and that becomes their own. And 4s tend to be more focused inwardly on their own feelings. Take in information, relate to life through feelings, and they're more image conscious than the other triads. The last triad is the fear or head triad. Those are the 5s, 6s, and 7s. Driven by fear. 5s internalize it, 6s externalize it, and 7s run away from it. They take in information and relate to the world through their thinking. And they think and plan before acting. Now, the second way you can group these types into different groups is called stances. Now, stances aren't mentioned in Chapter 2, but I do mention them because it can be so clarifying if you're searching for your type to understand a bit about the stances. Yeah. Thinking. Doing, thinking, and feeling. Mm-hmm. So, stances are the second way to group any Enneagram type. They are determined by the center of intelligence that is repressed. So,
Can I trade you, Mike?
yeah, I'm sorry if that's not working. Hello? Okay. So repressed centers. By the way, if you're repressed in thinking or feeling or doing, you're repressed in one of them. Try not to be offended. Like, if people hear they're repressed in thinking, it's hard not to hear stupid. That's not what that means. If you're repressed in doing, as I learned that I was, I thought, yes, I am lazy. I would not use that word now. That's not what I think now. We'll explain it more later on. The one exception is I think people who are repressed in feelings don't care that they're repressed in feelings, but sometimes other people are offended. So your stance is determined by the center of intelligence that's repressed. Other helpful things that you'll learn from your stance is that they describe the way you get your needs met through your relationships with people, and it suggests that each of us has an orientation to time. That'll become clear in a moment. The aggressive stance are the 3s, 7s, and 8s. They are feeling repressed. So you're going to notice here, when we had triads, all of those people were next door neighbors. 2s, 3s, and 4s in the feeling triad. 5, 6, and 7 in the thinking. And going around the top of the circle, 8, 9, and 1 in the doing. But in your stances, you have 2 next door neighbors and somebody that lives across the street, I guess. So your 3s, 7s, and 8s are in the aggressive stance. They are feeling repressed. It said that they move against others or stand independently, and they take action to get their needs met. Now, this push against people, that can sound adversarial or combative, and it can be, but not always. It's better to think about these people just know what they want, and every step they take is in the direction of what they want, and they are not even aware that people or systems are standing in their way. They just keep moving in that direction. So that's what's meant by moving against them. They don't allow others to stand between them and their goals. Now, their orientation to time is the future. If you're a future-oriented person, you're always planning for, thinking about, striving for, wanting something out there in time. And that's why every step they're taking is for that. They're just really driven about getting that thing that's out there in the future. And it's worth noticing that they're rarely sticking around when the confetti falls when they get there, because they're on to the next thing. If you have an aggressive stance person, I heard a story recently about somebody friends with a 7, and they were on a trip, a boys' getaway or something, that they'd planned for. The 7 had talked about all this time. And when they were there, that 7 was talking about, and the next time when we come back, he wasn't even really in the moment necessarily. The next stance I'll introduce you to is the compliant, sometimes called the dependent stance. Those are your 1s, 2s, and 6s. Those are the folks who are thinking repressed. This stance moves toward others as opposed to against. They just move toward to meet people, and they get their needs met externally. They ask questions of the people they're moving towards. They seek guidance and reassurance from them to arrive at decisions, form opinions, and find security. That's why they go to people. They want to talk it through. They're often more community-minded than people in other stances, and they have difficulty thinking for themselves in a truly productive manner, even if they are highly intelligent and successful. Their orientation to time is the present moment. And the final stance is the withdrawing stance. Those are 4s, 5s, and 9s. We're doing repressed. They move away from others. Not against, not toward, away to get their needs met because they take care of themselves from within. When they make decisions, form opinions, process their place in the world, they do it in the privacy of their own minds and hearts. And so others can sometimes feel shut out. And their orientation to time is the past. That can be unhealthy at times if we're dwelling on the past, but it can also be healthy to reflect on the past. I don't think it's necessarily negative to allow myself to be informed by the past when I think about how I want things to be in the present moment or in the future. So that is the withdrawing stance. All right. And we have some time to finish up with Lori.
I just have a story of somebody who looks toward the future. I was thinking when you were talking about the boys' weekend, somebody in my house is oriented toward future, and we were sitting in the Miami airport getting ready to fly to, or no, in the South Bend airport, getting ready to fly to Miami. And he was so excited about the trip that he got on and made plane ticket reservations for the next trip that we were going to take to. So you can probably figure out who it was. So for the ending part of each time that we have together, we will talk a little bit about growth, spiritual growth, growth in relationships, personal growth for that particular number. So for each number, we will talk about what if you live with that number? What if you have a relationship with that number? And what that might look like. That'll give us a chance to look at some of the characteristics and ways of responding that we may observe in a person who is that particular number. Hopefully, as we learn more about each type, we'll become less likely to just react to how that type may handle conflicts or fear differently than we do, and give us a chance to recognize that they're living in ways consistent to their type. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're always living as a healthy number or responding in a healthy way, but it'll help us recognize at least some of the why of why they may be acting like they are. The childhood message that they may have heard or absorbed, what may be repressed in them, and it may allow our hearts to be softer toward them and help us move toward them with compassion. If they're versed in the Enneagram as well, it may give us a common vocabulary to be able to approach and work toward resolution with them. It allows us also to celebrate their strengths and realize what they're bringing to the relationship that we may not be bringing. For each week, we will also take time to talk about if this is your number, what might you do to encourage growth? So we'll look at what it might mean for you to explore more deeply what you can learn about yourself as a particular number. That might include looking at possible truths about that number as a group. And it may also give us a chance to look at ways that you can challenge yourself and ways that you might be kind to yourself. And then lastly, we will look at specific ways for each number to encourage spiritual growth, to strengthen your spiritual walk. So as we learn more about each type and how each type experiences the world, we'll also explore how each type might experience relationship with God. For example, the body or the gut type of the 8s, 9s, and 1 will have different experiences than the heart types and the head types. So we'll look at different ways to deepen that relationship with God by understanding how each type experiences the world. And we'll also look at ways to grow personally and spiritually by looking at lies that we may believe about ourselves based on those childhood messages we heard or absorbed. And we'll talk specifically about spiritual practices that may be appropriate for each type, including the ideas of silence and solitude and stillness as ways to sit before God in prayer. We'll also explore some different prayer postures and ways to engage our unique selves in dialogue or conversation with God to help us grow both in the unique type and color, flavor of the Enneagram that we are, for things that may come naturally to us, but also ways that may stretch us in our number to experience God in new ways. So we welcome you on this journey with us. We're excited to be here, and we look forward to the next weeks with you.
Thank you.